The opening chapter of The Hunger Games foreshadows almost everything that happens across the original trilogy, and it's an absolute masterclass in character introduction and establishing a setting. And rather than tell you about it, I think what I actually want to do is just read this with you. So let's go, we're starting on page 1. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. Prim is doomed from the very start. This paragraph alone tells us that Prim is Katniss's primary motivation. That's established elsewhere in this chapter as well. For doing just about anything. Tells us that they don't have a lot of money. It's a rough canvas mattress cover. And it starts with Prim being gone. Sitting at Prim's knees, guarding her, is the world's ugliest cat. Mashed in nose, half of one ear missing, eyes the color of rotting squash. Prim named him Buttercup, insisting that his muddy yellow coat matched the bright flower. He hates me. Or at least distrusts me. Even though it was years ago, I think he still remembers how I tried to drown him in a bucket when Prim brought him home. Scrawny kitten, belly swollen with worms, crawling with fleas. The last thing I needed was another mouth to feed. But Prim begged so hard, cried even, I had to let him stay. It turned out okay. One thing I will never shut up about is the way that Buttercup stands in as a narrative metaphor for Katniss in each book. Katniss's primary motivation? Guarding Prim. Buttercup, introduced in the story, is sitting there guarding Prim. The opening chapter of Catching Fire. Katniss misses her old life in the Seam. Doesn't feel like she fits in the Victor's Village. So she goes back to the old house in the Seam, and you know who's there? Because he also misses their old life? Buttercup. Opening chapter of Mockingjay, where Katniss feels adrift, and like her family is the only thing keeping her even remotely grounded. Goes back to District 12, finds Buttercup, stuffs him in a bag and brings him back to 13 with her, where he continues to fill in as a narrative stand-in for Katniss by jumping at lights on a wall as Katniss is trying to figure out what on earth she can do to attain a prize that is just barely out of reach, Peeta. It's so freaking brilliant. Anyway, our part of District 12, nicknamed the Seam, is usually crawling with coal miners heading out to the morning shift at this hour. Men and women with hunched shoulders, swollen knuckles, many of whom have long since stopped trying to scrub the coal dust out of their broken nails, the lines of their sunken faces. But today the black cinder streets are empty. Shutters on the squat gray houses are closed. The reaping isn't until 2. May as well sleep in if you can. This tells us 2 things immediately. 1, this is a coal mining town, and it's a coal mining town that's suffering. And 2, that the reaping, which is just barely acknowledged in that opening paragraph, is a thing that will affect this entire district. Our house is almost at the edge of the Seam. I only have to pass a few gates to reach the scruffy field called the Meadow. Separating the meadow from the woods, in fact, enclosing all of District 12, is a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire loops. This should tell us that District 12 is enclosed. People can't leave. Katniss leaving, as she's about to do on that next page, is illegal. She is breaking rules. That's important. As soon as I'm in the trees, I retrieve a bow and sheath of arrows from a hollow log. Electrified or not, the fence has been successful at keeping the flesh eaters out of District 12. Inside the woods, they roam freely, and there are added concerns like venomous snakes, rabid animals, and no real paths to follow. I don't even have words. Those specific threats in that specific order. Venomous snakes, Coriolanus Snow. Rabid animals, hijacked Peeta. No real path to follow. Katniss feeling lost and adrift after she loses pretty much everything that's ever mattered to her in Mockingjay, and struggling to find a way to come back to herself. But there's also food if you know how to find it. My father knew, and he taught me some before he was blown to bits in a mine explosion. There was nothing even to bury. I was 11 then. 5 years later, I still wake up screaming for him to run. I'd like to point out a couple of things there. First, that this is the first point where it's established that Katniss is 16, and it's only because we can do that simple math that she was 11 when she lost her father. It has been 5 years, and she's still extremely, extremely traumatized. And also that she's screaming for him to run from a mine explosion, when running wouldn't necessarily have been able to save him. But you know what you do run from? An attack. And we can intuit from other books in this series that that explosion was not an accident. My bow is a rarity, crafted by my father along with a few others that I keep well hidden in the woods, carefully wrapped in waterproof covers. My father could have made good money selling them, but if the officials found out, he would have been publicly executed for inciting a rebellion. Okay, this tells us, just like that barbed wire fence, that this is not a democracy, this is not a free place. You don't get arrested and then publicly executed for inciting rebellion, for owning a bow and arrow, somewhere that is not a police state, which this pretty clearly is. District 12, where you can starve to death in safety, I mutter. Then I glance quickly over my shoulder. Even here, in the middle of nowhere, you worry someone might overhear you. Okay, so it's not just a police state, it's a surveillance state. Good, cool. When I was younger, I scared my mother to death. The things I would blurt out about District 12, about the people who rule our country, Panem, from the far-off city called the capital. Eventually, I understood this would only lead us to more trouble. So I learned to hold my tongue and to turn my features into an indifferent mask, so that no one could ever read my thoughts. Do my work quietly in school, make only polite small talk in the public market, discuss little more than trades in the hob, which is the black market where I make most of my money. Even at home, where I am less pleasant, I avoid discussing tricky topics. Prim might begin to repeat my words, and then where would we be? Y'all, this tells us a good couple of things right here. One, that Katniss's mother, not so much a rebel, but Katniss is picking this up from someone. She's a kid at that point in what she's remembering. She's repeating this from someone, presumably her father. And we know that repeating things that her father has told her have gotten her in trouble before, from what we learn in Mockingjay about the hanging tree. And what this also tells us is that Katniss is not actually all that concerned about her own safety. She's very specifically concerned about Prim's safety. As early as page 6, Prim is a more effective tool to getting Katniss to shut up than literally anything else. Then we have a cute little bit where Gale hands Katniss a loaf of bread with an arrow stuck in it, and I can talk for a very long time about how that is some immediate foreshadowing that Katniss and Peeta are going to end up together right from the start. But instead, I actually want to skip over to Katniss describing Gale. He could be my brother. Straight black hair, olive skin. We even have the same gray eyes. But we're not related, at least not closely. Most of the families who work the mines resemble one another this way. That's why my mother and Prim, with their light hair and blue eyes, always look out of place. They are. My mother's parents were part of the small merchant class that caters to officials, peacekeepers, and the occasional seam customer. They ran an apothecary shop in the nicer part of District 12. Since almost no one can afford doctors, apothecaries are our healers. My father got to know my mother because on his hunts he would sometimes collect medicinal herbs and sell them to her shop to be brewed into remedies. She must have really loved him to leave her home for the scene. I try to remember that when all I can see is the woman who sat by, blank and unreachable, while her children turned to skin and bones. I try to forgive her for my father's sake, but to be honest, I'm not the forgiving type. This tells us so freaking much about Katniss and the relationship that she has with her mother, about Astrid and what she gave up in order to be with Burdock, and, more than anything, the class differences within District 12, and the absolute poverty that permeates 12. And then that's exacerbated even further with the interaction that Gale has with Madge, the mayor's daughter. I don't like that Gale took a dig at Madge, but he's right, of course. The reaping system is unfair, with the poor getting the worst of it. You can see why someone like Madge, who has never been at risk of needing a tessera, can set him off. The chance of her name being drawn is very slim compared to those of us who live in the seam. Not impossible, but slim. And even though the rules were set up by the capital, not the district, certainly not Madge's family, it's hard not to resent those who don't have to sign up for tesserae. And that's the thing. What Gale says is, what can you have, 5 entries? I had 6 when I was just 12 years old. And Katniss says that's not her fault. And Gale says, no, it's no one's fault, just the way it is. And Katniss is making it very clear here that she understands that it is the capital's fault, that the capital is the real enemy here. But she also can't help but feel that degree of resentment. And then there's a line that really drives it home, which is, it's to the capital's advantage to have us divided among ourselves, he might say. If there were no ears to hear but mine, if it wasn't reaping day, if a girl with a gold pin and no tesserae had not made what I'm sure she thought was a harmless comment. And it's funny because that's exactly what Katniss becomes in Catching Fire, a girl with a gold pin and no tesserae. Now from here we get into the description of the games and the reaping, and we get Prim's name pulled. But it's everything that leads up to that I just think is so incredibly well done. It just deserves a teeny tiny bit more attention.